I'll just say a couple of things. One is, of course, that I'm presenting this on behalf of all my co-authors of the BSBI Plant Atlas, Pete Stroh, Kevin Walker and Tom Humphrey from the BSBI, and my colleague Rich Birkmar, web developer from UKCEH. So obviously this isn't my own work, far from it, or some of it is, but not the totality, of course. We'll find out how many other people contributed in a moment. The other thing to say is I suppose I should have subtitled this A View from Plant Atlas 2020 because the amount of data that were collected and the amount of possible insights are legion. And so this is really just a single view that fits into half an hour from me. So it's more of A View rather than the view. Probably should have clarified that. So I'll just turn off my camera and hopefully we won't have any delays caused by sluggishness. And first test is whether I can actually, yes, there we go. So that's not too bad. Great, so I'm sure many of you listening will have already heard something about the Plant Atlas 2020 survey, either from purchasing it yourself, from looking at the website, or seeing information about it on Twitter, or perhaps you've even read some of the introductory chapters. My erstwhile colleague Chris Preston once remarked that if you wanted something to go completely beneath the radar, then you should write it in an introductory chapter to an atlas, because his experience was that nobody reads them. So perhaps some of this information will be novel and interesting to those of you who have purchased it as well. So obviously the Plant Atlas 2020 survey was just published this year, but it was based on recording effort by the BSBI over a 20-year period. 8,500 botanists is definitely an underestimate because obviously there are many teams of people who went out recording who didn't necessarily get their names on the record and such like, and historic data sets and things where we only have summary data at the 10-kilometer scale. So I'm sure that's a significant underestimate of the actual number of boots on the ground that were sending in records of plants. So obviously the aim was to record the locations of all wild plants in all of the grid squares in Britain and Ireland, and that led to almost 30 million new records, but that's only in that 2000 to 2019 period. There was also new digitization of old records that took place during that period. And of course, there were all the data that were already in the database from the 2000 Plant Atlas and the 1962 Plant Atlas. So in fact, the number of records that actually underpin the analysis and the maps is much closer to 50 million than it is to 30 million. But that just shows you that it was a significant proportion, around 60% of the data set that were collected only in that last 20-year period. And the total number of taxa covered, natives and non-natives, of course, is given there as well. That's on the website. It's about 2,800 that were covered in the book. So in the introductory chapters of the Atlas, there are a number of aims stated, but two of the main ones I'll just go through here. Perhaps the most obvious is to map the distribution of all flowering plants and ferns growing in the wild in Britain and Ireland. There are a number of qualifications to growing in the wild that are detailed in the introductory chapters to the Atlas, some of which impinge on the recording of non-native species. So, for instance, in the wild counts as anywhere outside of private parks and gardens, and not recording planted crop species. However, there are exceptions to that. So trees and shrubs planted in the wild or in gardens or parks and things were reported. And one of the reasons for that was for consistency with earlier atlases and to accommodate that kind of what's perhaps become something of a tradition in BSBI plant recording as to what's recorded and what's not. But the upshot of that is we have those almost 3,500 distribution maps for species, with that information broken down by date class. This map here for early marsh orchid comes from the website, and therefore it's got 5 different date classes or time periods that the dots are divided into. The maps in the book only have 4, and that was because of the number of colours that are easily distinguishable by the human eye. We were advised that it was only 4, so that's the reason for that discrepancy between the book and the website. Of course, in these types of maps, we only see the latest observation for any given 10-kilometer square displayed, but those counts in the legend, and obviously all the information that goes into the temporal change analyses that I'll mainly be talking about today, acknowledges all of those layered dots, if you will, from earlier periods for squares where there are more recent observations. So as I've said, relevant for this talk particularly, we're mapping natives and non-natives, so those plants that were introduced by humans, and that includes both ancient introductions, such as the common poppy and many other arable weeds, and modern introductions, which I'll go on to speak a bit more about. I'll talk about these definitions a bit more in subsequent slides. The second main aim, which also impinges on the talk, is to look at change in distribution between time periods. It says here that the change is assessed between the 3 atlases, and that's broadly correct, of course, although there will be new information for historic time periods because of that digitization effort that's gone on in recent decades. Also, actually, for the change analyses, we used a 4th period as well as the 3 main recording periods for the atlases. So the 2000 to 2009 date class was separated out. That was primarily because there was also very good coverage in that period, particularly the local change systematic random survey of 2 kilometre squares that the BSBI conducted in 2003-2004. But the general idea is to take that kind of comprehensive census effort that went into those atlasing periods and come up with estimates of temporal change of species distributions at 10 kilometre. That example there is a bee orchid. I suspect you probably can't see that on your screens, showing the consolidation and expansion of its range over those time periods. And then the second point here is just that you don't need to worry about what Frescalo is, but just know that it's a method that attempts to adjust for overall or changes in overall effort between time periods and between locations as well. So between like sections of the British Isles over time. So it attempts to account for the fact that there was greater overall effort in those later 2 time periods than there was particularly in the 1962, or to be correct, the 1950 to 1969 date class. And that information is also summarized as a trend bar, which I'll go on to talk about very briefly now. So one of the things when we're estimating change from these type of data is that there's a lot of noise in the data, and we have to use a statistical method to summarize that. But then we also have to take that statistical method and actually summarize it so it's intelligible to people looking at the website and understanding what that really means. It's not much use to say there's a mean of this and a standard error of this if people don't know what the means of and don't know what a standard error is and all these types of things. So we tried to come up with a way of making these changes intelligible and also to condense them so that we weren't giving false precision, and so people could have an intuitive or quasi-intuitive understanding of the trends. So basically what we did is we did something called bootstrapping, where we fitted, so this is an example for Honungia petraea, I should say, and we created basically 100 linear trends. So this is particularly a straight line trend across the time periods, both for the long and the short term. And then we looked at the distribution of the slopes of those lines. So obviously some of them might be steeper than others. They might all be the same. Depends how much variation there is in our estimates from this method of change. But once we've got that distribution of slopes, we then basically just simplified it into 5 different categories. So if there was a very large increase, that slope would have gone into the strong increase category on the far right of the bar chart on the right of your screen. If it was a very steep decline, it would go in the strong decline category. And by separating all of these different slopes into different categories, we could get a kind of simple summary of what happened to that species. So in this example, about 60% of the trends were in the moderate decline, maybe about 38% in stable. So on balance, and this recognizes the uncertainty in these types of assessments using slightly biased data, we think probably it's declined, although there's a possibility that it may have been stable and even a very small probability that it's increased. But this is the reality of working with these types of noisy atlas data that weren't necessarily collected according to any structured protocol. So I'll skip over this because I think you know probably all about the website now. And there is just to say 2 things. One is that there's an excellent YouTube video from Rich Berkmar on the BSBI's YouTube account showing all the kind of interactive features of the website and how to interrogate it efficiently. The other thing to say is that I noted yesterday that Princeton Press have a discount on their website now, so you can get the book 50% off. So apologies for anybody that paid more than whatever that works out as. But if you don't have it, now might be a good time to buy it. So moving on to kind of the meat of our talk and the focus on non-native species, I just wanted to kind of overview some definitions, just in case I use them later in the talk, and in case you've seen them on a slide or somebody else's talk this week and you're wondering what they mean. So obviously a native species, I'm sure you will know, is a species that arrived in an area without any human assistance from a source population that was native. But then European botanists introduced these two categories of non-native species, the archaeophytes and the neophytes, which I'll break down the results into later in the talk. The ancient introductions are basically plants that were introduced by humans to an area before 1500 AD. Now that could be to the British Isles as a whole, it could be to Britain specifically, or it could be to Ireland. You have to have some context when you're using these terms. And neophytes is the same, but after 1500 AD. 1500 was chosen to represent the approximate time of the discovery of the New World, when lots of species started moving across continents. So naturalized, or a synonym established, just means a species is self-perpetuating within some area. Can be by seed, or it can be vegetatively. The reason I've written there that can be hard to define is that if it's not the fact that you can see that it's vegetatively reproducing, but there's a bit of a grey area in terms of when you decide that a plant that's vegetatively spreading is actually established. For instance, something like red osier dogwood, Cornus sericea, that often spreads, an individual shrub might spread by layering. There's only one plant, and it's just one plant that's layered, around the mother plant, as it were. If that was, say, the only example in an area in a county, or even the British Isles, obviously it's not for that species, then it's hard to know where to draw the line to say whether that's established or not. Obviously, for a tree that just sits in one place and lives for hundreds of years surviving, we don't normally define that as established if it's not reproducing by seed. But if it was layering or had some rhizome that was going out and spreading over a short distance, you might consider it established. As I say, there's no real hard and fast dividing line there. It's a matter of scale, perspective, and purpose. So invasion often just means the spread of a species into an area, and that has been used historically to refer to native and non-native species. Much cited example of a native doing that, or being defined as a native, is the collared dove for Britain, obviously. And that was widely discussed as an example of an invasion, still is. Invasive, that can be ambiguous. It can just mean spreading in the sense that I previously mentioned, or it can mean having an undesirable impact, or it can mean both. So often, you sometimes need to ask people what they mean when they use that term. Less ambiguous is, I'm sure, a big focus of this week, which is invasive non-native species, which is clearly a non-native species having an undesirable impact. But then impact itself needs defining, and that's an effect of an organism on some part of the environment. But obviously, in order to exist, an organism needs to have some impact on its environment. So in the context of non-natives, it typically means an impact that's classed as undesirable by some set of humans. So, it's a value-based definition. It's based on a fact, of course, that some observation of some impact, but classing it as undesirable is obviously the value-based element of that. So I'd just say a couple of things about how we look at these distribution changes and what it really means. So as I think I've already made clear, we're talking about, at least with the Plant Atlas here, changes in range size measured at 10 kilometre. So all these changes that I'm talking about are about the loss or the gain of 10 kilometre locations. And obviously that you get different patterns potentially by looking at different scales, looking at the occupation, say, of SSSIs, or counties, or 1 kilometre squares might give you a different pattern, a different rate of change than looking at 10 kilometre. Obviously 10 kilometre might not be sensitive enough to pick up some changes. And that's obviously related to impact. A change at 10 kilometre is not necessarily a change in impact. If 10 kilometre square only needs a single plant in order to be classed as present, that might not be having any impact that anyone wants to class as undesirable. So you need to keep that in mind when we're talking about these changes and what they mean in a landscape sense. I'll skip that next bit. That's just talking about what we mentioned earlier about the data being grouped into time periods. And so we're looking at change between broad date classes of multiple years. And we also need appropriate taxonomic lists for looking at these changes as well. We need to do things like aggregating over taxa that were not perhaps consistently distinguished through time, otherwise there'll be biases, and some changes might just be to do with recorder ability or the presence of identification guides. So we need to be careful that we're not modelling taxa that were not looked for consistently, and that applies especially to non-natives, which are go into in a moment. This just gives you an idea actually of the challenge of modeling these types of data when there's such a huge increase in effort. So on the left, we've got counts of species hectad combinations. So every time a species is observed in a unique hectad, it counts as one here. And you can see the massive increase in the native green chunk there. It's clearly not to do with new natives arriving in the country or spreading natives, because, you know, on average, natives have declined over the period there. That's all entirely to do with new records of things that we must assume were there for a very long time, but just not previously recorded. So we need to be quite careful with that. And that's particularly true at finer scales, which isn't like, as we can see on the right here, with the huge increase in 1 kilometre, 2 kilometre records after 1990 in particular. So that's why we kind of talk about these 10 kilometre changes. So one key thing for the non-native species and these assessments of change that we've done for the Plant Atlas 2020 is that there has been a very real increase in the ability of recorders to recognise and identify and just fundamentally have an interest in non-native plants in the landscape over the 20th century. And part of this is reflected in the inclusion of species in common floras that people use for identification. And these numbers here are taken from Clive Stace and Mick Crawley's recent book, Alien Plants in the New Naturalist series, which is an excellent chapter on the development of the treatment of non-native plants in Britain and Ireland over the, well, not just over the 20th century, but back in time. And so, you know, recorders for that first Plant Atlas in 1962 were using generally Clapham, Tooten and Warburg, published in 1952, this first edition of this flora, but that only included 700 alien species, and even then only 450 of those are actually in the key, so a lot of them were just mentioned in passing without any aid to identification. So we must assume that people using this flora, on the whole at least, were probably not able to recognise and identify a whole host of perhaps garden escapes and other things that may have been present in the landscape. So we just don't have that information for the most part, or where we do, it might be severely biased, just limited to 1 or 2 recorders who have particular interests. Now in 1991, we had the first edition of Stace's Flora, which had full treatment of 1,500 aliens, went up in later editions, which really increased the interest in recorders of recognising and identifying alien species. So even if nothing else happened, if there was no change in the landscape, we would have expected lots of non-native species, particularly neophytes, those recently arrived, primarily garden escapes, to increase in the database. So we have to be very careful about that when we're looking at change. And it's going back to that point about we need to make sure we're modelling taxa that we're looked for consistently, otherwise we might fool ourselves as to what's actually happened. And that point underlies one quirk or well, feature, not really quirk, but feature of the change estimates from Plant Atlas 2020. This table here is from chapter 6 of the book, not available. Well, the introductory chapters of the Atlas are available on the website as a PDF. So even if you haven't bought the book, you can look at this. And this just breaks down the number of trends that we have across all status categories for Britain and Ireland, and the statuses here relate to those statuses for Britain and Ireland separately. So it's like I was saying earlier, like an archaeophyte in Britain is not necessarily an archaeophyte in Ireland, etc. But the key thing here is between the long term, so going back to the first atlas, the 1950 to 1969 date class, and the short-term trends, which only go back to the 1987 to 1999 date class, there's an increase, particularly for the neophytes, in the number of taxa that we were able to model. So for the long term, for the neophytes, we only used taxa that were described in Clapham, Tooten and Warburg, and also and most of those are also ones that were mapped, that actually received maps in the first 1962 Plant Atlas as well, because otherwise those long-term trends would probably have been very biased for those other species. For the short term, we used a much broader set of neophytes. So as you can see there, it goes up to 836 from 226 for Ireland, up to 406, sorry, for Britain, up to 460 for Ireland from 254. It's a huge jump in our ability to produce what we think are primarily unbiased trends for the neophytes for those date classes, those time periods. And that's particularly important when we're making aggregate statements about what's happened across the British Isles as a whole. And that's not to say that all of those trends are unimpeachable either, but I'll come on to that. And also just to say there that there are lots of other trends on the website broken down to the country level. So obviously we didn't check every single one of those 22,000 trends, so have to keep that in mind as well. So this information, these individual species trends that we'll see quite a lot of in a moment, we also summarized them at various aggregate levels and did different things with them. For the summary report for Britain and the summary report for Ireland, which are available also on the website as PDFs, we did an even simpler summary job on the left there. So rather than using those 5 categories that I mentioned earlier, things like strong decline and moderate decline were collapsed into just decreasing, and then moderate increase, strong increase were collapsed into increasing. So we just reduced those into 3 simple categories. And this example for England here really just shows the strong disparity between those modern introductions where over 60% are increasing and only about 22% decreasing. The archaeophytes where get over 60% decreasing and only about 18% increasing. And then the natives where, again, like the archaeophytes, is that like 65% decreasing and only a very small number of increasing natives. And a lot of those are probably ones where there are non-native genotypes or infraspecific taxa that perhaps have been amalgamated up into those data. The patterns are different between different countries. I've just used England here as an example. For instance, for England, England is there. For Ireland, for the short-term trend, their number for increasing modern introductions was 80%. So again, a big disparity there, or a big increase there from England to Ireland. Although that may partly be due to biases in the data. On the right, we've got a kind of more descriptive trend of how the average across those sets of species changed over time. And again, this kind of tries to propagate the uncertainty from those individual species level trends. But the key thing here, again, is that the neophytes are increasing much more strongly in the short term. But remember, that's averaging over 800 odd extra species, whereas in the long term, that's only about 240 species that trend is averaging over. And also of interest there, you can see those ancient introductions, that decline may have tailed off in England over the short term, whereas if you fit it to the whole time series, that decline is emphasized because of that strong drop from that first time period. And again, those results are in the country level reports, but also in chapter 6 of the atlas itself. So for the last part of the talk, I'm just going to go through a number of species, number of examples, and give you some examples of the trends and what they look like from the website. So with those archaeophytes, so those kind of non-natives that made it to Britain before 1500 that we often think of as honorary natives for conservation purposes, you know, a lot of the ones that have decreased were arable weeds, and you know that's primarily due to intensification of arable cropping since the 50s. There's corn marigold there, spreading hedge parsley. Obviously, a lot of sites may have also been converted to pasture or lost to development. There was a site here in Crowmarsh Gifford opposite CEH that had spreading hedge parsley that was lost to a housing estate just within the last 5 years. But those charts on the right there give you an idea of how precipitous those declines were from the first atlas to the last 3 date classes, and those declines have really tailed off since then. There are other reasons, of course, there are other patterns. So loss of northern low intensity or extensive arable, often kind of crofting or subsistence farming of some type, are behind some of the declines of archaeophytes in the north and the west of their ranges. So even something as, if you live in the English lowlands, something as common as hedge mustard does show a very probable decline in the short term. And even though the expert caption there thought perhaps that there'd been no significant change in the distribution, those effort adjusted trends, particularly for Wales and Scotland, show that the picture is much more likely to be one of decline, and that's probably to do with that long-term or loss of low intensity arable. Same for black bindweed there as well, but much more severe in Britain, a strong decline there for this classification of the slope estimates, and in Ireland as well, at least a moderate decline, if not strong. There have been some good, well, increases on the archaeophyte side as well. So obviously some of those arable weeds are now planted throughout the countryside in kind of a wildflower planting schemes or urban meadows or whatever you want to call them, which has led to some really strong increases. Things like corn cockle. Going back to the definitions that we looked at earlier, it's interesting to consider that corn cockle may well have been considered an invasive non-native species by ancient Britons, where whilst it was invading their crops and tainting their wheat. So that just goes to show that, you know, the definition of an invasive non-native species is relative to the, you know, the values and of the society that's doing the classification at the time. Obviously now it's an attractive arable weed that we like to conserve. Lots of other archaeophytes, some other archaeophytes I should say, associated with warm winters, dry disturbed grassland have also spread. So the two there, Erodium muscatum and Valerianella carinata, both of which have shown really strong increases. Neophytes, obviously we heard a lot about this when the atlas was launched, so I won't go into this in too much detail, or at least not this slide anyway, because this is taken from Kevin Walker's presentation that he did when the atlas was launched. I'm sure you will have all heard of these species and their spreads, but that 58% of neophytes increased is based on that summary, 3-category summary that I showed you for England a few slides ago. And of course, a lot of that is down to the recording of neophytes post 1987, the recording of planted trees and shrubs in the wild, but also of escapes from gardens. But obviously a lot of those species are benign and not having what are classified or considered as undesirable impacts. But obviously some of them are, Crassula helmsii here and the American skunk cabbage and Sitka spruce obviously are considered generally by Vice County Recorders to have local impacts where they are expanding, and I'll go on to that more in my final slide. Lots of other species with huge increases, lots obviously garden escapes, Alchemilla mollis, things a bit more weedy like the narrow-leaved ragwort there, and things that have now, you know, even within, you know, the last 20 years now are common components of urban floras like water bent. I think water bent's seen like a 15-fold increase in hectads since the new atlas in 2000. So all of their trends were just strong increase. You know, they have really skyrocketed. Whether or not there may be climate change elements to this as well, but also human movement of species around the landscape. Again, whether or not they're having impacts in any given location is often very context specific. There are also some decreasing neophytes as well. Lolium multiflorum there, that's probably related to that archaeophyte decline that I mentioned in terms of the loss of less intensive agriculture. Italian ryegrass was often included in lay arable rotations in lower intensity agriculture, so that may be due to its loss on the northern and western fringes of its range. Some of them were not really clear, so tall rocket, it's been hypothesized that it's due to cleaner seeds, that decline. The loss of wild privet, which is a non-native species in Ireland, is particularly hard to explain, and nobody's contacted me a reason for this, and it's not really clear unless it's due to wetter winters in already wet parts of Ireland or something like that. I don't think we've had nobody's written in with an explanation for that one. Something also which is very interesting, which wasn't really highlighted when we launched the Plant Atlas, was the declines in a lot of well-known invasive species at the 10-kilometre scale over the short term. So all of these high-profile invasive non-native species show very probable declines over the past 35 years. So Japanese knotweed, almost certainly declining at the 10-kilometre scale, maybe a moderate decline rather than a strong decline, but assuming we can trust the model, and there's no reason to suspect any massive bias for that one, nor for giant hogweed, it seems like we probably should be saying that these things are declining. Again, for curly waterweed there as well, almost certainly declining at the 10-kilometre scale. And other people have noted this as well, I think, with less quantitative analyses, but just you know, in kind of Vice County assessments. So there are also a number of species that have shown markedly different patterns between the long term and the short term. There's just a couple of non-native examples here. So again, you know, normally considered an invasive non-native water fern, a huge increase between the first Plant Atlas and the new Atlas in 2000, but then an equally precipitous decline since then. That's definitely the strongest N-shaped trend for the long term in the Plant Atlas, and is the strongest Voltiface of any species that we analysed. And you can see the linear fits there as well, demonstrating that. So that's one that's kind of had a boom and bust, or at least seems to have a boom and bust cycle. This isn't on the website. It's not given in the species accounts, but these tables are in the PDF of the introductory chapters and in the book as well. And this is summarizing those species where there has been a big change between the long and the short term. So these are ones where that change has been positive. So the one we just looked at was negative, but then many others. So like Bromus seculinus there, Rhibroma has gone from a moderate positive slope in the long term to a much steeper one. So that rate of change has increased. Likewise for some urban weeds like Mexican fleabane and cocksfoot grass and things like that. So it's and even the natives that are up there like Hypericum, Androsimum, that's probably largely due to non-native genotypes of garden escapes or confusion with similar taxa. Likewise, Helleborus fetidus, yes, there are no doubt native genotypes, but that change is probably due to a non-native garden element. So it's really interesting to look through these, and we've got, again, the statuses here are for Ireland and Britain separately. So again, neophytes topping the slope change, the increasingly positive slopes in Ireland as well. The losers, there are far fewer neophytes, although as we saw, Isola is topping the charts there with Elodea canadensis. It seems that aquatic weeds are particularly prone to these boom and bust cycles, and not fewer archaeophytes. Blightum bonus Henricus is the highest ranked archaeophyte there, where the slope is even steeper in the short term, a steeper decline than it was in the long term, maybe due to the tidying up of farmyards, things like that, loss of these very high fertility environments in farmed environments. So again, I'm overrunning, so I won't go through too many of the other trends there, but these tables are very interesting. And although we only listed the top 50, we will publish the whole data set before the end of the year so people can download those spreadsheets. Finally, I'm just going to highlight this study, which wasn't part of the Atlas, but it was done with the BSBI and the BSBI Vice County Recorders. And it's interesting because it complements the view at the 10-kilometre scale. What happened here was that Katharina Dehnen-Schmutz at Coventry University sent a questionnaire to Vice County Recorders and asked them to rank the impacts of a certain national set of invasive species, but also to volunteer their own locally invasive species and to give ranks to their impacts that they perceive them at their Vice County level, and to include other information on that, such as native species that might be affected, and also to give their confidence in those trends. So again, this is just a table of the top species that reported, the number of Vice Counties that were reporting them, the level of impact that was reported for those species. So you can see Impatiens, Glandulifera, Himalayan balsam came top, 73% of Vice Counties reporting it as a species with an impact in their Vice County, and a very high rank. So that means that most Vice County recorders were putting it first or near the top. And you can look through that, but you can see that this gives that small scale assessment of impact, which is missing from the 10-kilometre scale views of change from the Plant Atlas. There's a lot of other interesting information in that paper. That's just a distribution of which Vice Counties responded and what the kind of average rank there was for the species that they viewed. So obviously there's going to be a human specific element to that, in that some people are more likely to rank things as having larger impacts than others, but there may also be a real difference there in terms of, in some areas, more species are having exerting more effects on native species or other things. And we also did this nice presentation, which is just a fragment of this here, showing which native species were recorded or reported by Vice County recorders as having impacts in which broad habitats. And this is quite a big kind of network diagram, so I've only given a fragment of it here, but it's quite interesting to look through and see across that very nice biogeographic spread of Vice Counties which species are considered to actually have significant undesirable impacts in particular broad habitats. The reference is there, and that paper is open access. So sorry, I overran slightly, but I'm sure we've still got time for some questions. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that. If anyone does have any questions, do you want to pop them in the chat box, and we've got a few minutes for those now. If you have any questions, you can put a hand up as well, if that's easier. I think there aren't any. Oh, here we go.
Stunned into silence. I know.
No, it was a brilliant talk. Thank you. Yeah, Katerina's just put in a useful link to a project about recording impacts invasive species.
Great, thanks, Katerina.
Okay. Joni.
Oh, hi. Thanks for the presentation, Ollie. I just wondered, in terms of kind of looking at collecting data for the next atlas, what are the key ways in which you're looking to address reducing that uncertainty around the plant distribution data? Are you looking to modify the protocol at all for data collection, or change the scale at which you're collecting the data? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It's a good question. I think the first thing that I should say there, which the BSBI would no doubt want me to say, is that the BSBI haven't committed to doing another atlas at this point. So it's a huge amount of effort doing an atlas, and it's very hard to get advanced funding for doing such things. And so there isn't any assumption that there will be another atlas. I mean, of course, there may well be, but it's not guaranteed. There's no plan to do that. So that would be my first comment there. Obviously, that doesn't mean that people will stop recording, but it does mean that there may or may not be a formal coordinated effort to recensus Britain and Ireland at that scale. That's the first point. The second point is, I suppose, that for the long-term trend, there's always going to be uncertainty, because the data collection historically, even with the best will in the world with regards to digitization and such things, was incomplete, and there are those biases which are unsalvageable. So there's always going to be uncertainty, at least for the long-term trends, and that would include the current date class, 2000 to 2019. If there was another atlas and then we extrapolated from this date class, there are uncertainties in this date class. There are lots of biases that I didn't go into, but aquatic plants weren't really recorded in a representative way in the last 20 years, so their trends are not as believable as trends of other groups. So the only way to really reduce uncertainty totally, or not totally, sorry, that's the wrong word, to reduce it to a kind of, just so it's kind of random error rather than bias, is to have a structured monitoring scheme. So something like the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. But of course, that does a different thing in that it's aiming at getting a representative view of habitats at a small scale in terms of plant abundances. And, if you do that across the whole of Britain, you're not going to pick up all of the very rare species and rare non-natives and things that type of project doesn't focus on, sorry. So there are structured schemes for looking at certain things, such as the abundances of species in semi-natural habitats. But in terms of reducing uncertainty for a national project that seeks to census all 10 kilometers squares, that's extremely difficult when you don't have funding and it's all dependent on volunteer efforts. I think realistically, there's always going to be some quarter bias that needs to be taken into account, unless somebody turns around and funds professional staff to survey every 10 kilometre square in Britain and Ireland thoroughly every 20 years, which some countries do something approaching that, like Switzerland has a state-funded biodiversity monitoring scheme which tries to do that, but it's probably unrealistic in most other places.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Do you have time for one other question, Ollie, if there are any?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think that's it.
Great. Well, if people want to ask me a question by email or complain, then my email's there anyway. So thank you.
No, not at all. Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the invite, Lucy. Enjoy the rest of the week.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thanks for joining. Bye.